Two people can drink the exact same amount of water every single day, same 8 glasses, same effort, same good intentions, and yet one of them sees steady, predictable blood sugar numbers, while the other watches their readings bounce around like they're on a roller coaster with no idea why. If you've ever done everything right, taken your medication on schedule, watched your carbs, gone for your daily walk, and still seen your glucose numbers swing in ways that don't make sense, I want you to stay with me for the next few minutes because the missing piece might not be your diet at all. It might be something as simple as when and how you're drinking your water. There's a specific time of day when water matters more than any other. There's a common habit, one almost every one of my patients has done at some point, that can quietly spike or even mask what's really happening with your blood sugar. And there's a simple method I walk my own patients through that takes less than a minute to understand, but can change how reliable your readings are. I'm going to explain all of it. But first, let's talk about why this even matters. I'm glad you're here. On this channel, we talk about the everyday habits that quietly shape how well you manage conditions like prediabetes and type 2 diabetes, the kind of practical, grounded guidance that doesn't get enough attention. Hydration is one of those topics. Most of what you hear about water and health is frustratingly vague. Drink more water. Stay hydrated. Nobody explains why the timing matters or how the way you drink water can actually influence your blood sugar readings and your day-to-day energy. That's what we're covering today. We'll walk through the real science behind how water affects glucose concentration in your blood, the single most common mistake I see in my own patients, the correct way to time your water intake for better stability, how dehydration symptoms can be confused with blood sugar symptoms, and by the end, a simple daily routine you can start using tomorrow. No fear, no overwhelm, just something clear and useful. My name is Dr. Andrea Reyes, and I've spent a good part of my career working with older adults who are navigating prediabetes, type 2 diabetes, and the day-to-day reality of managing their health at home. What I've learned, over and over, is that the biggest wins usually don't come from dramatic changes. They come from small, overlooked habits that nobody ever properly explained. Before I go further, I do want to be upfront with you. This video is educational, and it's not a substitute for the personalized care your own doctor can give you. Please talk to your physician before making any changes to how much water you're drinking, especially if you're living with kidney disease, heart failure, or you're on a fluid restriction or a diuretic. I want you to walk away from this informed, not anxious, and definitely not making changes that aren't right for your specific situation. Let me tell you about a patient I'll call Margaret. She's 68, a retired school teacher, and honestly, one of the most disciplined people I've worked with. She lives alone, walks every morning without fail, and reads more about health than most of my colleagues do. About a year and a half ago, she was diagnosed with prediabetes. Her fasting glucose numbers were sitting right on that borderline line doctors don't love to see. She wasn't on any medication yet, but given her family history of type 2 diabetes, she was taking it seriously. Margaret was one of those patients who did her research. She'd read that water was good for her, so she made sure to drink plenty of it every single day. But here's where it gets interesting. When Margaret came to see me, she was confused, frustrated even. Her glucose readings weren't consistent. Some days they looked fine. Other days, for no reason she could point to, they were higher than expected, even on days when she said her eating had been identical. She'd done everything her research told her to do, and she still couldn't explain the pattern. To understand what was actually happening with Margaret, we first need to understand something most people never learn about water and blood sugar. Here's the piece almost nobody explains to you. Your blood sugar reading isn't just about how much sugar is in your blood, it's also about how much water is in your blood. When you're even mildly dehydrated, the fluid volume in your bloodstream drops, which means the sugar that's already there becomes more concentrated, and that can make your glucose reading look higher than it would if you were properly hydrated. On top of that, dehydration triggers certain stress hormones in the body, including one called vasopressin, and those hormones can actually push your blood sugar upward on their own. Think of it like a glass of juice. If you pour a small amount of juice concentrate into a full glass of water, it tastes mild. But if that same amount of concentrate sits in a nearly empty glass, it tastes intensely strong, even though the actual amount of sugar hasn't changed at all. Your blood works the same way. The sugar level itself might be fairly stable, but how concentrated that sugar appears on a reading can shift dramatically depending on your hydration status in that moment. This is actually a well-recognized factor in how accurately glucose monitoring reflects what's really going on in the body. Hydration status is known to influence reading accuracy, which is part of why two people eating the same meal can get very different numbers. So if a senior skips water first thing in the morning and then checks their glucose around midday, they might see a number that looks alarming and assume it's about food, when hydration was quietly playing a role the whole time. Now, I want to be clear about something, because I don't want you running to chug a glass of water right before your next test. That creates its own kind of inaccuracy, just in the opposite direction. This isn't about gaming your numbers. It's about understanding what's influencing them in the first place. When I sat down with Margaret and looked at her routine, this was the first thing that stood out. She barely drank anything overnight or first thing in the morning, and by the time she tested midday, her body had been running on very little fluid for hours. That alone explained some of her confusing numbers. But it wasn't the only issue. There was something about how she drank water throughout the rest of her day that was working against her, too. Margaret, like a lot of people, wasn't drinking water steadily. She was drinking it in bursts, usually a large glass right before a meal, or worse, catching up on her daily total in the evening because she'd forgotten to drink much earlier in the day. This is one of the most common patterns I see, and it's worth understanding why it matters. When you drink a large volume of water all at once, especially right before eating, it can cause temporary shifts in digestion and short-term fluid dilution that make glucose absorption patterns harder to predict. There's also the physical effect of gastric distension, your stomach stretching from a large volume of fluid right before a meal, which can affect how comfortably and efficiently you digest what comes next. And for older adults especially, sudden large fluid shifts are simply harder on the kidneys to regulate compared to steady, moderate intake throughout the day. Picture watering a garden. If you water it slowly and evenly across the day, the soil absorbs it well and the roots stay nourished. But if you dump an entire bucket on it all at once, most of that water just runs off the surface. It doesn't get absorbed the way you'd want. Your body handles water in a similar way. It's built for steady input, not sudden floods followed by long droughts. And here's something worth pausing on if you're on certain medications. Diuretics or blood pressure medications can make large, sudden fluid swings even more significant, potentially affecting your electrolyte balance. This is exactly why I always tell my patients that any real changes to their fluid habits should be discussed with their own doctor first, especially if medication is part of the picture. When I walked Margaret through her actual daily pattern, she realized something she hadn't noticed before. Almost nothing in the morning, a full bottle at lunch, then more in the evening trying to hit some vague daily goals she'd read about online. It wasn't that she was drinking too little water overall. It was that the pattern itself was working against her. So if timing really matters this much, what does the right pattern actually look like? This is the part I want you to really pay attention to because it's the most actionable piece of everything we're covering today. The goal isn't to drink more water. It's to drink it with rhythm. Steady hydration, say, a modest glass about 20 to 30 minutes before a meal, supports healthy digestion and may help moderate the glucose spike that often follows eating. And spacing your water intake evenly across your waking hours supports more stable blood volume, which, as we just talked about, means more reliable readings and steadier energy throughout the day. I like to compare it to keeping a campfire going. If you feed it small logs steadily, it stays warm and consistent the whole time. But if you let it die down and then dump a huge pile of wood on it all at once, you get a brief, overwhelming burst, followed by more unpredictability. A simple rhythm looks something like this: a glass of water when you wake up, before your body has gone through a full night without fluid. A glass before each meal, giving your body a head start rather than flooding it during digestion. Small, consistent amounts between meals rather than saving it all up. And then gradually easing off in the evening so you're not disrupting your sleep with frequent trips to the bathroom. Now, I do want to gently flag something here, because I've seen patients overcorrect once they learn this. This isn't permission to drastically increase your total water intake. More isn't automatically better. And for some people, particularly those with kidney conditions or heart failure, too much water can actually be unsafe. What we're talking about here is rhythm, not volume. It's a conversation to have with your own doctor about what your personal fluid target should be, and then applying that same amount with better spacing. When Margaret started applying this, not changing how much she drank, just when, something shifted. Within about 2 weeks, she told me her energy felt steadier throughout the day, and her glucose readings, while still not perfect, were far more consistent and far less confusing than before. Before we go further, I'd love to know something from you. What time of day do you usually drink most of your water? Is it spread out evenly, or does it tend to cluster around certain times, like Margaret's did? Drop a comment and let me know. I read through them, and it genuinely helps me understand what patterns are most common among the people watching this. Now, there's one more piece of this puzzle that I think is honestly one of the most overlooked, and it has to do with how easily dehydration can disguise itself as something else entirely. Here's something many seniors don't realize. Mild dehydration produces symptoms that overlap almost exactly with blood sugar symptoms: fatigue, dizziness, brain fog, headaches. If you're someone who's watching for signs of high or low blood sugar, these overlapping symptoms can be genuinely confusing because your body isn't always clear about which system is sending the signal. Think of it like static on an old radio. Dehydration adds noise to the signal, and that noise can make it much harder to hear what your blood sugar is actually telling you underneath it. I've had patients feel shaky and immediately assume it's low blood sugar, when really it was mild dehydration, and in response, they'd eat something to correct what they thought was happening, which then genuinely did affect their glucose, even though that wasn't the original problem at all. Margaret experienced this too. She told me that on a few occasions, she'd felt foggy and tired in the early afternoon and assumed, with real worry, that it meant her prediabetes was progressing. It caused her a fair amount of anxiety before we ever talked about it. When we looked closer, those episodes lined up almost exactly with the days she'd had very little water by that point in the day. It wasn't a complication. It was thirst wearing a disguise. Now, I want to be very clear about something important here. This is not a reason to dismiss real symptoms of high or low blood sugar. Those still absolutely require proper testing and, when needed, medical attention. What I'm describing is simply one additional factor to consider, one more piece of context before jumping to the most alarming conclusion. I teach my patients to think of hydration as one variable among several, not a replacement for checking their actual numbers. For Margaret, just understanding this distinction brought a real sense of relief. She stopped assuming the worst every time she felt a little off and started asking a more useful question first. When did I last drink water? So how do we bring all of this together into something simple enough that you can actually start using it starting tomorrow? Here's the framework I walk through with my own patients, and I want you to think of it less as a rigid rule book and more as a rhythm you can settle into. Start with a glass of water when you wake up. Before coffee, before anything else, your body has gone hours without fluid overnight. Have a modest glass about 20 to 30 minutes before each meal. Sip small, consistent amounts between meals rather than letting long stretches pass with nothing. And begin easing off in the evening so your sleep isn't interrupted. That's genuinely it. It's not about hitting a rigid number of ounces or tracking every sip on an app. It's about consistency over the course of your day. I'll say this one more time because it matters. Your exact fluid needs depend on your kidney function, your heart health, the medications you're taking, even the climate you live in. This routine is a starting point for a conversation with your own doctor, not a replacement for one. Please personalize it with their guidance. For Margaret, this became less about rules and more about awareness. She wasn't tracking obsessively. She was simply more attuned to her own rhythm throughout the day, and that awareness alone gave her more confidence and, frankly, more peace of mind. When I saw Margaret for a follow-up a couple of months later, she wasn't a different person, and her prediabetes hadn't magically disappeared. That's not how any of this works, and I never want to promise something like that. But she felt more in control. Her readings made more sense to her. Her anxiety around random symptoms had eased because she finally had a framework for understanding what her body was actually telling her. And her conversations with me had become more productive too, because she was bringing real observations instead of just confusion. The lessons here are simple, but they're easy to overlook. Hydration genuinely affects how your blood sugar readings look and how your body functions day to day. Timing and consistency matter more than the total amount of water you drink. Symptoms can overlap in confusing ways, so it's worth checking hydration before assuming the worst. And small, sustainable habits beat drastic, stressful changes every single time. Please talk with your doctor before adjusting your fluid intake in any meaningful way, especially if you're managing kidney health, heart conditions, or taking medications that affect fluid balance. I want to leave you with this. Understanding a detail like this isn't about fear, and it isn't about adding one more thing to worry about. It's about giving yourself one more piece of clarity in a process that can often feel confusing. That's what real empowerment in managing your health looks like, not perfection, just a little more understanding each time. If this was helpful, I'd love for you to subscribe so more guidance like this reaches you when you need it. And if you know someone who might relate to Margaret's story, consider sharing this with them. I'd also love to hear in the comments what your own hydration habits look like and whether anything here surprised you.